The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 4B at the Riverside County Superior Court creaked open at exactly 9 a.m. on what would become one of the most shocking days in California family court history. Judge Margaret Harrison, a veteran of 32 years on the bench, took her seat as bailiff Robert Chon called the packed courtroom to order. The gallery was filled beyond capacity. Reporters from local news stations, court observers, social workers, family members, and curious legal students who had heard whispers about this high-stakes custody battle that had been dragging on for 18 brutal months. At the center of it all sat 7-year-old Emma Martinez, a tiny figure dwarfed by the massive witness chair that seemed to swallow her whole. Her legs dangled several inches from the floor, and her small hands were buried deep in the thick golden fur of Bailey, a magnificent golden retriever whose intelligent amber eyes seemed to take in every detail of the tense courtroom atmosphere. Emma's dark hair fell like a curtain around her pale face, partially hiding the haunted look in her brown eyes that had seen things no child should ever witness. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Not the comfortable quiet of respectful attention, but the heavy, uncomfortable silence that comes when everyone knows they're about to witness something profound. Emma hadn't spoken a single word in 8 months and 12 days. Not to the court-appointed child psychologist Dr. Amanda Foster. Not to the social worker Mrs. Chun, who visited weekly. Not even to her own mother Sarah, who sat in the front row with tears already streaming down her cheeks. The only sounds Emma made were occasional whispers to Bailey, so soft they were barely audible even to those sitting closest to the witness stand. Bailey wasn't just any service dog. The 3-year-old golden retriever had been specially trained by the Sunshine Service Dog Foundation, a cutting-edge program that paired traumatized children with dogs trained in revolutionary communication techniques. While most people in the courtroom saw Bailey as simply an emotional support animal, a comfort companion to help calm Emma during the proceedings, the truth was far more extraordinary. Bailey had undergone 18 months of intensive training, with former FBI behavioral specialist Maria Santos learning to recognize and respond to dozens of hand signals and behavioral cues that indicated various forms of distress, fear, and trauma. The dog's training went beyond typical service animal skills. Bailey could distinguish between different types of anxiety, general nervousness, versus specific fear of a particular person. He could recognize signals for physical pain, emotional distress, and most critically for this case, indicators of sexual abuse. The revolutionary program had been developed after years of research showed that traumatized children often lost their ability to verbalize their experiences, but could still communicate through carefully taught nonverbal methods when paired with a specially trained canine partner. Emma's selective mutism had begun exactly 8 months and 12 days ago, following a particularly traumatic weekend visit with her father, Michael Rodriguez. That Monday morning, instead of her usual cheerful chatter about school and friends, Emma had simply stopped speaking. At first, Sarah Martinez thought it was just a phase, perhaps. Emma was acting out due to the stress of her parents' bitter divorce proceedings. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, it became clear that something far more serious had stolen her daughter's voice. The custody battle had been vicious from the beginning. Michael Rodriguez, a successful real estate developer worth millions, had hired the city's most expensive legal team. His lawyers painted him as a devoted father being kept from his beloved daughter by a vindictive ex-wife who couldn't accept their marriage was over. They presented evidence of his financial stability, his ability to provide Emma with the best education, health care, and opportunities money could buy. They highlighted his involvement in local charities, his clean criminal record, and his apparent dedication to co-parenting. Sarah Martinez, working double shifts as a pediatric nurse to afford legal representation, struggled to prove what she knew in her heart. that something terrible was happening during Emma's court-ordered weekend visits with her father. She had only circumstantial evidence: Emma's increasing withdrawal after visits, unexplained nightmares, sudden fear of bath time, and eventually complete silence. But Michael was charming, wealthy, and convinced everyone that Sarah was simply a bitter ex-wife trying to poison their daughter against him. The courtroom observers watched Emma with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. Many assumed the child was simply overwhelmed by the formal legal proceedings, confused by having to choose between her parents. They saw her constant physical contact with Bailey as typical behavior for a shy child with her support animal. What they couldn't see were the subtle communications happening right before their eyes, the tiny hand movements, the specific ways Emma positioned herself, the meaningful glances she shared with Bailey. Dr. Rebecca Foster, the court-appointed child psychologist, had spent months trying to break through Emma's silence. She'd used play therapy, art therapy, even hypnosis. Nothing worked. Emma would sit in sessions, petting Bailey and occasionally nodding or shaking her head, but never speaking about her experiences. The few times Dr. Foster had asked directly about her father, Emma would curl into a ball, and Bailey would immediately position himself protectively around her, but the child never explained why. Maria Santos sat in the back row of the gallery, her trained eye watching every interaction between Emma and Bailey. As Bailey's primary trainer and the architect of the revolutionary communication program, Maria knew exactly what to look for. She'd seen the signs before, the way Bailey's ears would prick up when Emma made certain subtle gestures, the specific positioning the dog would take in response to different signals, the almost invisible communication system that had been developed over months of careful training. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric with anticipation. Everyone sensed they were about to witness something significant, though none of them could have imagined just how earth-shattering the next few hours would become. Judge Harrison checked her notes one final time, preparing to hear what she assumed would be routine testimony in a difficult but straightforward custody case. She had no idea that within the next hour, everything she thought she knew about this case would be turned upside down by the most unlikely witness of all, a golden retriever trained to decode the desperate communications of a traumatized child who had found a way to speak when human language failed her. Sarah Martinez's hands trembled as she clutched the worn leather purse in her lap, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. She sat rigid in the front row of the courtroom gallery, her pediatric nurse uniform slightly wrinkled from another sleepless night spent, poring over legal documents and frantically searching for any piece of evidence that might save her daughter. Dark circles under her eyes told the story of 18 months of pure hell, 18 months of fighting a legal system that seemed determined to hand her precious Emma over to the very man she was desperately trying to protect her from. Irony wasn't lost on Sarah, that she spent her days protecting other people's children as a nurse in the pediatric intensive care unit at Riverside General Hospital, yet she felt powerless to protect her own daughter. She'd seen the signs of abuse in countless young patients over her 12-year career, the withdrawn behavior, the fear of certain adults, the regression in speech and behavior. When those same signs appeared in Emma, Sarah knew with every fiber of her professional and maternal being that something horrific was happening during those court-ordered weekend visits with Michael. But knowing and proving were two entirely different things in a courtroom where money talked louder than intuition. Michael Rodriguez's legal team had spared no expense in painting Sarah as an unfit mother consumed by vindictive rage against her successful ex-husband. Led by Marcus Blackwood, the most expensive family attorney in Southern California, they had systematically dismantled every piece of evidence Sarah and her overworked public defender, Janet Mills, had tried to present. When Sarah testified about Emma's nightmares, Blackwood argued it was normal childhood anxiety from the divorce. When she mentioned Emma's sudden fear of bath time, he suggested Sarah was projecting her own issues onto innocent behavior. When she described Emma's withdrawal and eventual silence, he painted it as manipulation tactics learned from an emotionally unstable mother. The evidence Sarah had managed to gather felt pathetically inadequate against Michael's polished facade. She had screenshots of angry text messages where Michael called her vicious names, but Blackwood dismissed them as the heated words of a frustrated father being kept from his child. She had statements from neighbors who heard shouting coming from Michael's house during Emma's visits, but they were written off as normal parent-child interactions overheard through thin walls. She even had Emma's drawings from therapy sessions disturbing, images of dark figures and locked doors, but the court-appointed psychologist, Dr. Foster, had testified that children's artwork was too subjective to be considered reliable evidence. Sarah's financial situation made everything worse. While Michael lived in a sprawling $2.3 million mansion in the hills overlooking Riverside, complete with a swimming pool, tennis court, and Emma's own princess-themed bedroom, Sarah rented a modest 2-bedroom apartment 20 minutes from the hospital where she worked. Her nursing salary, while respectable, couldn't compete with Michael's real estate empire that generated millions annually. His lawyers had made sure the court was well aware of this disparity, arguing that Emma deserved the opportunities and advantages that only her father's wealth could provide. The custody evaluator's report had been devastating. While acknowledging that Sarah was a loving, dedicated mother, it recommended joint custody with Michael, having Emma alternate weeks, citing his superior financial resources and stable housing situation. The report mentioned Emma's selective mutism, but attributed it to general anxiety from the divorce proceedings rather than any specific trauma. It noted that Emma seemed comfortable during supervised visits with her father at the family court's visitation center, though Sarah knew this meant nothing. Predators were often skilled at appearing normal in public settings. Janet Mills, Sarah's public defender, had done her best with limited resources, but she was drowning in a caseload of over 200 families and simply couldn't match the preparation time that Michael's team of 5 lawyers could dedicate to destroying Sarah's credibility. During depositions, Blackwood had been ruthless, questioning Sarah's mental stability, suggesting she was suffering from post-divorce paranoia, and implying that her night shift work schedule made her an absent mother who was projecting her own guilt onto Michael. The character witnesses Michael had produced were impressive and convincing. His business partner testified about Michael's integrity and work ethic. His country club friends described him as a devoted father who constantly showed them photos of Emma and spoke lovingly about their time together. Even Michael's own mother, Elena Rodriguez, had testified about what a wonderful father her son was, how he'd always been gentle and patient with children, and how Sarah was clearly trying to turn Emma against him out of spite. Sarah's character. Witnesses felt weak by comparison. Her fellow nurses spoke about her dedication to children and her gentle nature, but they had no direct knowledge of Emma's situation. Her sister Maria testified about Sarah's devotion as a mother, but Blackwood had made her look biased and unreliable during cross-examination. Even Emma's pediatrician, Dr. James Kim, who had noticed changes in Emma's behavior, couldn't definitively link them to abuse rather than general divorce trauma. The most heartbreaking aspect for Sarah was watching Emma's deterioration over the months of legal proceedings. The bright, chatty little girl who used to sing Disney songs while helping with household chores had become a shadow of herself. Emma had stopped playing with her toys, stopped watching her favorite cartoons, and eventually stopped speaking altogether. The only time Sarah saw glimpses of the old Emma was during quiet moments with Bailey, when her daughter would whisper secrets into the dog's golden fur secrets that Sarah desperately wished she could understand. Sarah had tried everything to help Emma communicate about what was happening during those weekend visits. She'd bought dolls for Emma to act out scenarios, provided art supplies for expression, even learned some basic sign language in case Emma preferred nonverbal communication. But Emma remained locked in her silence, and Sarah was running out of options and money to fight for her daughter's safety. As Judge Harrison prepared to call the court to order for what might be the final day of proceedings, Sarah closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. She had no idea that the miracle she was desperately hoping for was sitting just 20 feet away in the form of a golden retriever, who held the key to unlocking her daughter's terrible secret. All she knew was that she was about to lose Emma to a monster, and there seemed to be nothing she could do to stop it. Michael Rodriguez straightened his $3,000 Italian silk tie and flashed his $1 million smile as he rose to take the witness stand. At 42, he was the picture of success, tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, and deep brown eyes that could charm anyone within seconds. His custom-tailored navy Armani suit fit his athletic frame flawlessly, and his confident stride across the courtroom commanded attention from every observer. This was a man who had built a real estate empire from nothing, who could convince investors to hand over millions with a handshake, and who was about to deliver the performance of his lifetime. Mr. Rodriguez, his lead attorney Marcus Blackwood, began with rehearsed precision. Please tell the court about your relationship with your daughter, Emma. Michael's expression softened with practiced emotion, his voice taking on a tender quality. That made several jury members lean forward with interest. Emma is the light of my life, he said, his eyes glistening with what appeared to be genuine tears. From the moment she was born, I knew she was something special. I was there for every milestone, her first steps, her first word, which was Daddy, by the way. I coached her toe ball team, taught her to swim in our pool, read her bedtime stories every night until... His voice caught slightly. Until Sarah decided to tear our family apart. The courtroom was captivated. Here was a father who seemed genuinely heartbroken by his separation from his beloved daughter. What they couldn't see was the calculating predator behind those tearful eyes, a master manipulator who had spent months grooming not just Emma, but the entire legal system that would ultimately decide her fate. Michael's testimony was a masterclass in deception. He spoke lovingly about weekend trips to Disneyland, where he'd photographed Emma smiling on every ride. He described elaborate tea parties in her princess-themed bedroom at his mansion, complete with formal invitations he'd handwritten in elegant script. He showed the court videos of Emma giggling as he pushed her on the custom swing set he'd installed in his backyard, worth more than most people's cars. Every piece of evidence painted him as a devoted father whose only crime was loving his daughter too much. I've saved for Emma's college fund since the day she was born, Michael continued, his voice strong with paternal pride. She already has over $200,000 set aside for her education, and I've started looking at the best private schools in the state. I want to give her every opportunity in life, music lessons, art classes, travel experiences that will broaden her horizons. I have the resources to make sure she never wants for anything. What the courtroom didn't know was that Michael's preparation for this performance had been methodical and ruthless. He'd spent months researching family court procedures, hiring private investigators to dig up dirt on Sarah's personal life, and coaching with a media consultant who specialized in helping clients appear sympathetic on camera. He'd practiced his facial expressions in the mirror, rehearsed his emotional responses, and even studied method acting techniques to make his tears appear genuine. Behind his polished facade lay a monster of calculated evil. Michael had been sexually abusing Emma for over 6 months, starting with seemingly innocent games during bath time that gradually escalated into horrific violations that no 7-year-old should ever endure. He was a master of psychological manipulation, using a combination of threats, bribes, and mind games to ensure Emma's silence. "Our special daddy-daughter time is just between us," he would whisper to Emma after each assault. "Mommy wouldn't understand our games. She would be very angry and might hurt both of us if she found out. Do you want Mommy to get in trouble?" When gentle manipulation didn't work, he would become more direct. "If you tell anyone about our special time, I'll make sure you never see Bailey again. And Mommy might have an accident at work. Hospitals can be very dangerous places." Michael had studied Emma's psychology as carefully as he studied real estate markets. He knew exactly which buttons to push, which fears would keep her silent, and how to make her believe she was complicit in their games. He convinced her that she was special, that their secret made her more grown-up than other children, and that telling anyone would destroy their family completely. The abuse had escalated gradually, allowing Emma's young mind to normalize each new violation before introducing something worse. Michael documented every phase of the grooming process with sick precision, keeping detailed notes about which tactics were most effective in maintaining Emma's silence. He knew from his research that children who were gradually conditioned to abuse often blamed themselves and were less likely to report it. His manipulation extended far beyond Emma. Michael had cultivated his public image as the perfect father for years before the abuse began, knowing that reputation would serve as armor if questions ever arose. He volunteered for children's charities, made substantial donations to local schools, and was photographed at every community event with Emma by his side, smiling and apparently happy. When Emma first began showing signs of trauma, the nightmares, the regression in behavior, the fear of bath time, Michael had been ready with explanations. He told Sarah that Emma was just going through a phase, that she was acting out because of the divorce stress. When Sarah questioned Emma about her weekend visits, Michael had already coached his daughter on how to respond. "Just tell Mommy we had fun," he would say during their car rides home. "Tell her about the ice cream we got, or the movie we watched. Don't mention our special games. It would make Mommy very sad and worried for no reason." As Michael continued his testimony, describing elaborate birthday parties and expensive gifts, the courtroom hung on his every word. Judge Harrison nodded approvingly as he outlined his plans for Emma's future private tutors, exotic vacations, connections to influential people who could open doors for her career. To everyone present, he was a loving father being unfairly separated from his daughter by a vindictive ex-wife who couldn't accept their marriage was over. But 20 feet away, Emma sat frozen in the witness chair, her small body trembling as she listened to her abuser spin lies about their special relationship. Her hands moved instinctively toward Bailey's fur, and the trained dog immediately sensed her distress, moving closer to provide comfort. Neither Emma nor anyone else in the courtroom yet realized that Bailey held the key to exposing Michael's carefully constructed web of lies. What the packed courtroom didn't understand, what even Judge Harrison, with her 3 decades of legal experience, couldn't have imagined, was that Bailey possessed abilities that went far beyond those of a typical service dog. The magnificent golden retriever sitting calmly beside Emma's witness chair was the product of the most advanced canine communication program ever developed, a revolutionary training system that had taken 18 months to perfect and represented a breakthrough in helping traumatized children find their voice when human language failed them. Bailey's journey had begun at the Sunshine Service Dog Foundation, a cutting-edge facility nestled in the hills outside San Diego, where former FBI behavioral specialist Maria Santos had developed her groundbreaking program after years of frustration. Watching child abuse cases fall apart due to victims' inability to testify, Maria had spent 15 years working with the Bureau's Behavioral Analysis Unit, specializing in crimes against children, and had witnessed countless cases where young victims were too traumatized, too afraid, or too psychologically damaged to speak about their experiences in ways that courts could understand or accept. The inspiration for the program had come from Maria's work with autism therapy dogs, where she observed how nonverbal children could communicate complex emotions and needs through carefully taught hand signals and body language that their canine partners could interpret and respond to. If dogs could be trained to understand and respond to the needs of autistic children who couldn't speak, Maria reasoned, why couldn't they be trained to help traumatized children communicate about abuse and danger? Bailey had been selected as a puppy from a championship bloodline known for intelligence, temperament, and emotional sensitivity. From 8 weeks old, he underwent intensive training that combined traditional service dog skills with revolutionary communication techniques that Maria had developed in consultation with child psychologists, trauma specialists, and animal behaviorists from universities across the country. The training process was unlike anything attempted before. Bailey learned to recognize and respond to over 50 distinct hand signals, each representing different types of distress, fear, or trauma indicators. The signals were designed to be subtle enough that abusers wouldn't recognize them, but specific enough that trained observers could understand exactly what a child was trying to communicate. A closed fist meant bad person. Touching the chest meant hurt me. Pointing to specific body parts while making eye contact with Bailey indicated different types of physical or sexual abuse. But Bailey's training went far deeper than simple signal recognition. He was taught to read micro-expressions, changes in breathing patterns, stress hormones in perspiration, and dozens of other subtle indicators that a child was experiencing fear or distress. His responses were equally sophisticated different body positions, movements, and behaviors that could convey the child's emotional state to trained observers who understood the communication system. The most remarkable aspect of Bailey's training was his ability to create protective barriers and safe spaces for children. When he received signals indicating that a child felt threatened by a specific person, Bailey would position himself between the child and the perceived threat, creating a physical and psychological barrier. If a child signaled extreme distress, Bailey would perform a specific sequence of actions that served as an emergency alert to any trained observers present. Maria had worked with veterinary neurologists to understand exactly how dogs could be conditioned to remember and execute such complex communication sequences. The training utilized positive reinforcement techniques combined with scent association, where Bailey learned to associate certain human stress hormones and body language cues with specific responses. The process required thousands of hours of repetition, with Bailey working with dozens of child actors who had been trained to simulate various trauma responses. The program also incorporated elements from police canine training, where dogs learned to detect drugs or explosives through scent alone. Bailey was trained to recognize the specific chemical signatures associated with fear, sexual arousal, and aggressive behavior in humans. This meant he could often sense danger or threat even before a child consciously recognized it, providing an early warning system that could prevent abuse from occurring. What made Bailey's training truly revolutionary was the incorporation of memory palace techniques adapted for canine cognition. Just as humans could be trained to remember vast amounts of information by associating it with familiar locations, Bailey was trained to associate different emotional states and signals with specific physical responses and locations within his mental framework. This allowed him to maintain consistent, reliable communication patterns even under the stress of high-pressure situations like courtrooms. The legal implications of Bailey's abilities were staggering, though few in the justice system understood them yet. In traditional child abuse cases, prosecutors struggled with victims who were too young, too traumatized, or too afraid to provide coherent testimony. Children's memories could be unreliable, their language skills insufficient to describe complex situations, and their fear of their abusers often made them recant their statements. But Bailey's responses were consistent, documentable, and based on objective observations that couldn't be influenced by coaching or intimidation. Maria had spent 2 years working with legal experts to develop protocols for introducing Bailey's communication evidence in court proceedings. The program had been used successfully in 37 previous cases across California, helping to secure convictions in situations where traditional testimony would have been impossible. However, most of those cases had involved private sessions with child psychologists or social workers, not the high-pressure environment of a packed courtroom during a contested custody hearing. The training process had been documented with scientific rigor, including video recordings of every session, detailed behavioral analysis, and peer review by experts in animal psychology, child development, and legal procedures. Bailey's responses had been tested and validated in controlled environments, ensuring that his communications were reliable and admissible as evidence in court proceedings. As Bailey sat alertly beside Emma's witness chair, his golden coat gleaming under the courtroom's fluorescent lights, he was constantly processing dozens of sensory input: scents, sounds, visual cues, and electromagnetic fields that humans couldn't perceive. His training had prepared him for exactly this moment, though none of the observers realized they were about to witness the most dramatic demonstration of interspecies communication in legal history. Maria Santos, sitting tensely in the gallery, watched every subtle movement of Bailey's ears, every shift in his posture, every micro-expression that crossed his intelligent face. She knew that Bailey was already picking up signals from Emma that would soon reveal the horrible truth that had been hidden for so long. The transformation began so subtly that most observers in the courtroom initially missed it entirely. As Michael Rodriguez continued his carefully rehearsed testimony about bedtime stories and Prince's tea parties, his voice dripping with false emotion and practiced sincerity, Emma Martinez sat frozen in the witness chair like a tiny statue carved from marble. Her 7-year-old frame seemed to shrink even smaller as her father's lies filled the air, each fabricated memory of their special relationship, sending invisible shockwaves through her traumatized psyche. Then, almost imperceptibly, Emma's small hands began to move. The movements started as barely noticeable tremors, her fingers twitching against Bailey's golden fur, as if she were fighting an internal battle between the desperate need to communicate and the paralyzing fear that had kept her silent for 8 months and 12 days. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, a physiological response that Bailey's sensitive nose detected immediately through the subtle changes in her scent stress, hormones flooding her system as fight-or-flight responses triggered by her father's presence reached critical levels. Bailey's amber eyes locked onto Emma's face with laser-like intensity. His 18 months of intensive training with Maria Santos had conditioned him to recognize these exact moments when a traumatized child was reaching the breaking point between silence and revelation. Every fiber of his being focused on Emma as she struggled to find the courage to tell her story through the only language she had left. I remember one particular evening, Michael was saying to the captivated courtroom, his voice taking on the warm, nostalgic tone of a loving father. Sharing precious memories, Emma and I were having one of our special daddy-daughter talks before bedtime. She looked up at me with those beautiful brown eyes and said, "Daddy, I love our private time together. It makes me feel so grown-up and special." The lie hit Emma like a physical blow. Her entire body recoiled as if she'd been slapped, and her hands moved instinctively to her chest in a gesture that looked like innocent fidgeting to most observers. But Bailey recognized it immediately, the signal for "hurt me" that had been drilled into his memory through thousands of training sessions. His ears pricked forward with alert attention as his highly trained senses detected the spike in Emma's cortisol levels and the acceleration of her heart rate. Emma's eyes darted frantically around the courtroom, taking in the faces of all these adults who seemed to be believing every word her father spoke. She saw the court reporter, nodding sympathetically at Michael's testimony, observed Judge Harrison's expression softening as he described their alleged bonding moments, and watched several gallery observers wipe away tears at his performance. The weight of their misplaced sympathy felt crushing, and Emma's chest tightened with the familiar panic that had stolen her voice months ago. But then her gaze fell on Bailey, and something shifted inside her. The golden retriever's intelligent eyes met hers with an expression of complete understanding and unwavering support. In that moment, Emma remembered Maria Santos's words during their training sessions. "Bailey is your voice when you can't find your own words, sweetheart. He understands your secrets, and he'll help you tell them when you're ready." With trembling fingers, Emma began to form the signals she'd practiced hundreds of times with Bailey during their private moments together. First came the closed fist pressed against her thigh, the sign for bad person that Bailey had been trained to recognize from any angle. The golden retriever's response was immediate and unmistakable. His relaxed posture shifted into high alert, his muscular body tensing as if preparing to spring into protective action. "Emma has such an imagination," Michael continued, unaware that his daughter was systematically dismantling his lies just 20 feet away. "She creates these elaborate fantasy worlds during our playtime. Sometimes she pretends to be a princess, locked in a tower, and I have to rescue her. Other times we play house, and she practices being a grown-up lady. Children that age are so naturally creative with their role-playing games." Each word felt like poison being poured into Emma's ears. The memories of what he was really describing, the horrific games that had stolen her childhood and shattered her sense of safety, came flooding back with devastating clarity. Her hands moved again, this time touching her chest, and then her lower body in the specific sequence that Bailey had been trained to recognize as signals for sexual abuse. Bailey's reaction was swift and dramatic. The highly trained dog immediately moved from his relaxed position beside the witness chair to a protective stance directly between Emma and her father. His movements were fluid but purposeful, each action carrying specific meaning that Maria Santos had programmed into his behavioral repertoire through months of intensive conditioning. The courtroom began to take notice. Several gallery observers pointed and whispered as Bailey executed a series of actions that seemed almost choreographed in their precision. First, he lay flat on the floor with his paws covering his eyes, a behavior that looked adorable to untrained observers, but was actually a trained response indicating that a child was signaling bad touch scenarios involving private body parts. Then Bailey stood and moved to Emma's left side, pressing his body against the witness chair in a protective barrier formation, while maintaining visual contact with Michael. His tail, which had been wagging earlier, now hung low and still another trained indicator that he was responding to signals of severe distress and threat. Court reporter Janet Mills, who had been documenting family court proceedings for 15 years, had never seen anything like Bailey's behavior. The dog's actions seemed too purposeful to be random, too specific to be coincidental. She found herself leaning forward in her chair, her stenotype machine momentarily forgotten as she watched the extraordinary communication unfolding before her eyes. Judge Harrison noticed the disturbance as well. "Is there an issue with the service animal?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of concern. "Should we take a brief recess?" But Emma wasn't finished. With tears streaming down her pale cheeks, she formed one final signal pointing directly at her father, while making the hand gesture that Bailey recognized as the ultimate emergency alert. The golden retriever's response was immediate and unmistakable. He began a low, mournful whine while positioning himself in what appeared to be a protective crouch, his eyes never leaving Michael's face. The tension in the courtroom became electric. Something profound was happening, something that transcended normal legal proceedings. But most observers couldn't understand what they were witnessing. The air seemed to vibrate with unspoken communication as Emma and Bailey shared their devastating secret through a language that bypassed human speech entirely. In the gallery, Maria Santos felt her heart pounding as she recognized every signal, every response, every nuance of the communication system she had spent years developing. She knew exactly what Emma was telling them, and the implications sent chills down her spine. The moment of truth had finally arrived. The moment Maria Santos recognized the devastating sequence of signals passing between Emma and Bailey, her blood turned to ice water in her veins. From her seat in the back row of the packed gallery, the former FBI behavioral specialist watched in horror as the communication system she had spent years perfecting revealed the unthinkable truth that everyone in the courtroom had been blind to for 18 agonizing months. Maria's hands trembled as she processed what she was witnessing. Emma's signals were textbook perfect, the closed fist for bad person, the chest and body touching indicating sexual abuse, the direct pointing at Michael, combined with the emergency alert gesture. Bailey's responses were equally precise, each movement confirming the devastating reality that this 7-year-old child had been systematically abused by the very man who was currently charming the court with fabricated stories of their loving relationship. Without hesitation, Maria shot up from her seat like a rocket, her chair scraping loudly against the marble floor and causing several heads to turn in her direction. Her sudden movement sent a ripple of confusion through the gallery, but Maria's focus was laser-sharp on reaching Judge Harrison before this mockery of justice could continue for even one more second. "Your Honor," Maria called out, her voice cutting through Michael's testimony like a knife through silk. "I need to speak with you immediately regarding the service animal's behavior." Judge Harrison's eyebrows raised in surprise. Interruptions during testimony were highly irregular, and she was momentarily taken aback by the urgency in Maria's voice. "Ma'am, you'll need to wait until—" "No, Your Honor, this cannot wait." Maria's voice carried the authority of someone who had spent 15 years dealing with life-and-death situations. She was already moving toward the bench, her credentials from the Sunshine Service Dog Foundation clutched in her trembling hand. "I am Maria Santos, Bailey's primary trainer and the developer of his communication program. What we're witnessing right now is a child reporting sexual abuse through a trained communication system." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Gasps echoed from every corner of the gallery as the implications of Maria's words hit like a thunderbolt. Judge Harrison's gavel came down hard multiple times as she called for order, but the damage was done. Cack was out of the bag, and there was no putting it back. Michael Rodriguez's face underwent a transformation that was visible to everyone present. The warm, loving expression he had been wearing during his testimony drained away like water from a broken dam, replaced by a mask of barely controlled panic. His lawyers immediately began whispering frantically among themselves, while Sarah Martinez sat in stunned silence, her hands covering her mouth as tears of validation and horror streamed down her cheeks. "Approach the bench immediately, Judge," Harrison commanded, her voice sharp with authority, as she processed the bombshell that had just been dropped in her courtroom. "Bailiff, please ensure the witness area remains secure." Maria practically sprinted to the judge's bench, her professional training kicking in as she prepared to explain the complex communication system that could finally give Emma the voice she had lost. Behind her, she could hear the courtroom buzzing, with shocked whispers and the sounds of reporters frantically scribbling notes or making phone calls to their editors. This was no longer just another custody case. This was about to become national news. "Your Honor," Maria began, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Bailey is not just an emotional support animal. He has been specifically trained through an FBI-developed program to recognize and respond to hand signals, indicating various forms of abuse and trauma. What Emma just communicated to Bailey was a clear, unmistakable report of sexual abuse perpetrated by her father. Judge Harrison's face went ashen as she absorbed the full weight of Maria's words. In 32 years on the bench, she had seen many shocking moments, but nothing had prepared her for the possibility that a child had been trying to report abuse through her service dog right in front of everyone. "Are you absolutely certain about this interpretation?" "Completely certain, Your Honor. The signal sequence was textbook perfect closed fist for bad person. Specific body-touching patterns indicating sexual abuse, direct identification of the perpetrator, and emergency alert status. Bailey's responses confirm every signal. I have 18 months of training documentation and 37 previous successful cases using this exact communication system." The implications were staggering. Emma had been sitting in that witness chair, surrounded by adults whose job it was to protect her, trying desperately to tell them about the horrific abuse she was suffering, and they had all been too focused on legal procedures to recognize her desperate pleas for help. The irony was crushing a child protection system that had failed to protect the very child it was designed to serve. Judge Harrison turned her attention to Emma, who was still trembling, in the witness chair with Bailey pressed protectively against her side. The little girl's face was streaked with tears, but for the first time in months, there was something resembling hope in her brown eyes. Someone had finally understood her secret language. Someone had finally heard her silent screams for help. "Mr. Rodriguez," Judge Harrison's voice cut through the courtroom noise like a blade. "Please remain seated while I call for an immediate recess to address this situation." But Michael was already rising from the witness stand, his survival instincts kicking in as he realized his carefully constructed facade was crumbling around him. The confident, charming demeanor he had maintained throughout the proceedings was rapidly dissolving into something much darker and more desperate. His eyes darted toward the courtroom exits as his lawyers grabbed his arms, whispering urgent instructions about remaining calm and not making any sudden movements. "Your Honor," Michael's attorney Marcus Blackwood interjected, his voice strained with barely concealed panic, "this is highly irregular. We object to any interpretation of animal behavior as testimony. There's no legal precedent for." "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Harrison interrupted sharply, "given the serious nature of these allegations, this court is calling an immediate emergency recess. Bailiff, please ensure no one leaves this courtroom until Child Protective Services arrives." The next few minutes passed in a blur of frantic activity. Court security moved to block the exits, while Judge Harrison's clerk frantically made phone calls to Child Protective Services, specialized child psychologists, and the district attorney's office. Maria returned to Emma's side, speaking in soothing tones to both the traumatized child and Bailey, whose protective instincts were in full alert mode. Sarah Martinez sat in stunned vindication. 18 months of desperate worry, finally validated by the most unlikely source imaginable. Her daughter had found a way to speak the unspeakable truth, and Bailey had been her translator, her protector, and ultimately, her savior. The truth was finally free, and there would be no putting it back. Within 23 minutes of Maria Santos's earth-shattering revelation, the sterile conference room adjacent to Courtroom 4B had been transformed into an emergency command center. Dr. Rebecca Chun, one of California's most respected child psychologists specializing in sexual abuse cases, had arrived with her specialized trauma interview kit, while Detective Linda Morrison from the Riverside County Sheriff's Special Victims Unit set up recording equipment with the precision of someone who had conducted hundreds of similar investigations. Emma sat in a child-sized chair specifically designed for trauma interviews, with Bailey positioned protectively at her side. The golden retriever seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, his intelligent amber eyes constantly monitoring Emma's emotional state, while maintaining the alert posture that indicated he was ready to facilitate communication at any moment. Maria Santos knelt nearby, ready to interpret the complex signal system that was about to unlock months of horrific secrets. "Emma, sweetheart," Dr. Chun began, her voice gentle but professional. "We know this is scary, but Bailey is here to help you tell us about things that might be hard to say with words. Can you show Bailey if someone has hurt you?" The little girl's hands trembled as she looked around the room at the faces of adults who were finally, truly listening to her. For 8 months and 12 days, she had been trapped in silence, carrying the weight of unspeakable violations while watching her abuser charm everyone around him. Now, with Bailey as her translator, she could finally release the burden that had been crushing her spirit. Emma's small fingers formed the familiar signals, the closed fist for bad person, followed by the touching gestures that indicated sexual abuse. Bailey's response was immediate and heartbreaking. The trained dog moved to create a protective barrier between Emma and the door, then performed the sequence that Maria had taught him to indicate sexual assault, lying down with his head between his paws, then standing and backing against Emma's chair while maintaining eye contact with the investigators. "She's indicating sexual abuse by a male perpetrator," Maria translated, her voice thick with emotion as she watched the communication system she'd developed being used to reveal such devastating truth. Bailey's positioning suggests the abuse has been ongoing and that Emma feels threatened by the presence of this person. Dr. Chun continued the careful questioning process, using Bailey as an intermediary to help Emma reveal details that would have been impossible for her to verbalize. Through the dog's trained responses to Emma's signals, a horrific pattern emerged. Weekend visits that had started with seemingly innocent activities, but gradually escalated into systematic sexual abuse that had stolen Emma's childhood and shattered her sense of safety. The abuse had been methodical and progressively worse. Emma's signals revealed that Michael had started with inappropriate touching during bath time, convincing her it was a normal part of their special daddy-daughter relationship. He had used a combination of threats, bribes, and psychological manipulation to ensure her silence, telling her that revealing their games would result in terrible consequences for both her and her mother. Emma's trembling hands showed Bailey the sequence first, scared of punishment, followed by signals indicating threats against her mother. The dog's response was to whine softly and press closer to Emma's side, behaviors that Maria recognized as responses to signals indicating fear of retaliation from an abuser. It became clear that Michael had convinced Emma that speaking about their special time would result in harm to the people she loved most. As the interview continued, Emma revealed, through Bailey's interpretation, that the abuse had escalated significantly in recent months. Michael had become more brazen, more demanding, and more threatening as he realized that Emma was beginning to understand that their games were wrong. A psychological pressure had become so intense that Emma's young mind had simply shut down, retreating into selective mutism as the only way to protect herself from a reality too horrible to process. Meanwhile, Detective Morrison was coordinating with the forensics team that had been dispatched to search Michael Rodriguez's mansion. The search warrant, expedited due to the emergency nature of the situation, had been signed within an hour of Emma's revelation. What they found there would haunt investigators for years to come. Hidden in a locked file cabinet in Michael's home office, investigators discovered a collection of photographs that documented the progression of abuse over 6 months. The images were organized chronologically, showing how Michael had gradually normalized increasingly inappropriate contact with Emma. Even more disturbing were the detailed journals he had kept, describing his methods for grooming Emma and maintaining her silence. The journals revealed the mind of a calculated predator who had planned every aspect of the abuse with meticulous precision. Michael had researched child psychology, studied trauma responses, and developed a systematic approach to breaking down Emma's defenses while maintaining his public image as a loving father. He had documented which threats were most effective, which bribes worked best, and how to manipulate Emma's emotions to ensure compliance. Computer forensics specialists uncovered even more damning evidence on Michael's encrypted hard drives. He had been part of an online network of predators who shared tactics for abusing children while avoiding detection. His communications with other members of this sick community revealed that he had been planning to escalate the abuse further and had been seeking advice on how to ensure Emma's permanent silence. Perhaps most chilling of all was the discovery of surveillance equipment that Michael had secretly installed in Emma's bedroom at his house. He had been recording her private moments, creating additional leverage to threaten her with if she ever considered speaking about their special relationship. The violation of privacy added another layer of trauma to an already devastating situation. As news of the search results reached the courthouse, Michael Rodriguez's carefully constructed world collapsed completely. His high-powered legal team abandoned him as the evidence mounted, and his business partners began distancing themselves from the scandal that was about to explode across every media outlet in California. Back in the interview room, Emma continued to communicate through Bailey, revealing details that would ensure Michael faced the full weight of the justice system. With each signal she made, with each of Bailey's trained responses, another piece of her burden was lifted. The dog who had been her silent confidant for months was finally helping her find the courage to speak her truth. The monster's mask had not just fallen away, it had been completely shattered, revealing the calculated predator who had hidden behind the facade of a loving father. Justice was coming, and this time, Emma would not face it alone. 18 months later, Emma Martinez stood confidently at the podium in the majestic chamber of the United States House of Representatives, her voice clear and strong as she addressed the packed gallery of congressmen, senators, child advocates, and media representatives from across the nation. Beside her, Bailey sat in perfect attention, his golden coat gleaming under the television lights, his intelligent, amber eyes scanning the room with the calm confidence of a dog who had helped change the course of American justice. "My name is Emma Martinez," she began, her 7-year-old voice carrying a strength that belied her age. "And I'm here to tell you about how Bailey saved my life and helped me find my voice again." The journey from that devastating day in Riverside County Superior Court to this moment had been extraordinary. Michael Rodriguez's trial had become one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in California history, not just because of the horrific nature of his crimes, but because it represented a revolutionary breakthrough in how the justice system could help traumatized children communicate about abuse. The evidence against Michael had been overwhelming. Beyond the photographic documentation, journals, and computer files discovered in his home, forensic medical examinations had confirmed the systematic sexual abuse that Emma had endured for over 6 months. His encrypted communications with other predators revealed a network of child abusers that led to arrests across multiple states. The case had grown from a simple custody dispute into a federal investigation that exposed one of the largest child exploitation rings ever uncovered on the West Coast. Michael's sentencing hearing had been a moment of profound closure for Emma and Sarah. Judge Harrison, who had been deeply affected by her failure to recognize the signs of abuse during the original custody proceedings, had imposed the maximum sentence possible under California law, 35 years to life in state prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. At 42 years old, Michael Rodriguez would likely die behind bars, unable to harm another child ever again. But Emma's story had resonated far beyond the courtroom. News outlets across the country picked up the remarkable tale of the little girl who had found her voice through her service dog, And the story went viral on social media platforms with hashtags like hashtag Bailey's Voice and hashtag EMMA's Law trending for weeks. Child advocacy groups, legal professionals, and animal rights organizations all rallied around the case as an example of how innovative approaches could help the most vulnerable victims find justice. The legal ramifications were immediate and far-reaching. Within 6 months of Emma's revelation, the California legislature had passed comprehensive reforms requiring family court judges, social workers, and child psychologists to receive mandatory training on recognizing signs of trauma and understanding service animal communication systems. The reforms, officially titled Emma's Law, established protocols for introducing specially trained service dogs into family court proceedings and created standards for validating animal-assisted communication as admissible evidence. The legislation didn't stop in California. Emma's case became a catalyst for similar reforms in 43 other states, with federal lawmakers introducing the National Child Protection Enhancement Act, which provided funding for training programs and established national standards for service animal communication systems in legal proceedings. The FBI incorporated Maria Santos's training protocols into their behavioral analysis programs, and specialized canine units began working with child victims across the country. Emma's recovery had been remarkable but challenging. With the support of Dr. Rebecca Chun and a team of trauma specialists, she had gradually rebuilt her ability to trust adults and communicate verbally about her experiences. Bailey remained by her side throughout the healing process, serving not just as her communication partner, but as a constant source of comfort and security. The bond between girl and dog had deepened into something extraordinary, a partnership that transcended the typical relationship between human and animal. Sarah Martinez had also found her voice through this experience. The pediatric nurse who had fought so desperately to protect her daughter became a powerful advocate for other parents navigating the family court system. She testified before legislative committees, spoke at conferences for child protection professionals, and co-authored a book with Maria Santos about recognizing signs of abuse and the revolutionary potential of service animal communication. Maria Santos's Sunshine Service Dog Foundation had expanded dramatically, with training facilities opening in 12 states and a waiting list of over 500 families seeking specially trained communication dogs for their traumatized children. The program that had started as an experimental project had evolved into a nationally recognized standard of care, with funding from government grants, private foundations, and individual donors inspired by Emma's story. The ripple effects continued to spread. Law schools began teaching horses on animal-assisted legal proceedings. Veterinary schools developed specialized tracks for training communication dogs, and child psychology programs incorporated service animal protocols into their curricula. Emma's case had fundamentally changed how the American justice system approached cases involving traumatized children who couldn't speak for themselves. Bailey didn't just help me tell my story. Emma continued from the congressional podium, her hand resting gently on the golden retriever's head. He helped me remember that I was brave, that I was strong, and that I deserved to be protected. Now we work together to help other kids find their voices too. The audience erupted in sustained applause as Emma concluded her testimony. In the gallery, Sarah Martinez wiped away tears of pride as she watched her daughter, now a confident, articulate advocate, address some of the most powerful people in the country. Beside her sat Maria Santos, whose innovative training program had evolved from a desperate experiment into a revolutionary tool for justice. As Emma and Bailey left the podium together, their partnership had already helped secure convictions in over 200 child abuse cases across America. The little girl who had lost her voice to trauma had found it again through the love and loyalty of a golden retriever. And together, They had given voice to countless other children who had been trapped. In silence, the darkness that had once consumed Emma's world had been transformed into a beacon of light that would guide other victims toward safety, healing, and justice for generations to come. Bailey had saved one little girl, but their story together had saved thousands more, proving that sometimes the most powerful voices come from the most unexpected places.